The most profound silence at the Family Feud studio that Tuesday afternoon came not from the audience, but from the labored breathing of 68-year-old Robert Martinez, as he slowly made his way down the bright corridors toward the stage. Each step was deliberate, measured, the movement of a man who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy for the battles that mattered. His wife Carmen walked beside him, her hand hovering protectively near his elbow, ready to steady him if the weakness that had become his constant companion threatened to overwhelm him. Behind them, their adult children, Miguel and Sofia, followed with the careful attention of people who had learned to read the subtle signs of their father's declining strength. Robert Martinez had been fighting cancer for 8 years. The first diagnosis had come at 60, lung cancer detected during what should have been a routine checkup. He'd approached that battle with the determination of a man who had built a successful construction business from nothing, who had raised 4 children, who had never backed down from a challenge in his life. 18 months of chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery had ended in victory. The cancer had retreated, and Robert had returned to work, to his family, to the life he'd built with the fierce pride of someone who had stared down death and won. 3 years later, it had returned. Different location, same enemy. The doctors had called it a new primary cancer, not a recurrence. But Robert knew better. This was round 2 of the same fight, and this time he'd gone into battle with the grim knowledge that victories could be temporary. Another year and a half of treatment, another slow crawl back to health, another celebration that felt more like an armistice than a victory. Now, at 68, he was facing his 3rd diagnosis. The oncologist had explained it gently but clearly: lung cancer again. More aggressive this time, spreading faster than their previous encounters. The treatment options were fewer, the prognosis more guarded, the path ahead uncertain. For the first time in his life, Robert Martinez was confronting the possibility that this might be a battle he couldn't win. The Family Feud appearance had been Carmen's idea, submitted during Robert's brief remission period when they'd been planning for better days ahead. When the acceptance call came 2 weeks after his 3rd diagnosis, Robert's first instinct had been to decline. He was tired, weaker than he'd been during his previous battles. And the thought of performing for television cameras felt overwhelming. But Carmen had insisted, with the gentle stubbornness that had sustained their 45-year marriage. "This might be our last chance to do something fun together, as a family," she'd said, and though she hadn't meant it as an ultimatum, they both understood the weight of her words. Robert had agreed because he'd spent his entire adult life making sure his family had what they needed, and if what they needed now was this moment of normalcy, of celebration, of shared experience, then he would find the strength to give it to them. Steve Harvey approached the Martinez family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth, but something about Robert's careful movements and the way his family positioned themselves around him immediately caught Steve's attention. In decades of hosting, Steve had developed an instinct for reading people. And there was something about this 68-year-old man's deliberate economy of motion that suggested someone managing serious illness. "Well, hello there, sir," Steve said, approaching Robert with the respectful formality he reserved for elders who clearly commanded family respect. "What's your name? And tell me about this beautiful family of yours." "Robert Martinez," he replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard despite its current softness. "This is my wife, Carmen, my son Miguel, my daughter Sofia. We're here from Phoenix, and this lady here," he gestured toward Carmen with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "She's been taking care of all of us for 45 years. Steve's trained eye caught details that spoke to Robert's condition. The way he gripped the podium for support, the careful spacing of his words to conserve breath, the protective positioning of his family members. There was something about Robert's presence that commanded respect, but also suggested someone fighting a battle that extended far beyond the game show studio. 45 years, that's beautiful," Steve responded. "And what do you do for work, Robert?" "I built houses," Robert said simply. "Started with my hands, ended with a company. Retired now." The brief answer carried volumes about a man who had built something from nothing, who took pride in creation and craftsmanship, and who was now facing a different kind of construction project, rebuilding his health one more time. As the Martinez family took their positions for the actual game, competing against the Johnson family from Atlanta, Steve found himself paying as much attention to Robert's stamina as to the flow of the game. The older man participated when required, his answers thoughtful and precise, but Steve could see the effort it cost him to maintain focus through the bright lights and sustained activity. During the first 2 rounds, Robert surprised everyone with his sharp responses, despite his obvious fatigue. When Steve asked for things that require patience, Robert confidently answered, building anything worthwhile, earning the number 2 spot on the board and revealing something fundamental about his approach to life's challenges. But it was during a commercial break before the final round that Steve witnessed something that would change the trajectory of the entire show. While the cameras were off and the crew was adjusting equipment, Steve watched Robert lean heavily against the podium, his breathing labored, his family gathering around him with practiced concern. Carmen whispered something to Miguel, who immediately went to get water. Sophia placed a steady hand on her father's back, and Steve could see the family's well-rehearsed choreography of care, the way they moved around Robert's needs without making him feel helpless. "You doing okay, sir?" Steve asked quietly. Approaching the family podium, Robert looked up, meeting Steve's eyes with the direct gaze of someone who had never been comfortable with pity, but who was too tired to pretend everything was fine. "Third time with cancer," Robert said simply, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that honesty was often easier than explanation. "This one's different. Harder." The simple statement hit Steve with unexpected force. Here was a man who had faced his mortality 3 times, who was carrying knowledge that no one should have to bear, and who was spending what might be precious time trying to give his family a moment of joy. The final round arrived with the Martinez family holding a comfortable lead, but Steve's focus had shifted entirely from the game to the man standing at the podium, who was clearly using reserves of strength he might not be able to replace. "We asked 100 people," Steve announced. "What's the hardest thing about getting older?" It was Robert's turn at the podium. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, his hands gripping the podium edge not just for emphasis, but for support. His eyes met Steve's with an intensity that suggested this question had touched something deep and personal. Steve repeated the question, his voice unconsciously gentling as he sensed this topic carried profound weight for Robert. "What's the hardest thing about getting older?" For a moment, Robert was silent, and Steve could see him wrestling with something larger than a game show answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying a wisdom that seemed to reach every person in the studio. "Knowing when you don't have enough fight left for the next battle," Robert said, his words measured and heavy with meaning. "I've been fighting cancer for 8 years. Bit it twice. But this third time, I'm tired, and I don't know if I have another war in me." The studio fell completely silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next laugh, but the profound silence of hundreds of people collectively confronting the reality of mortality, of the limits of human endurance, of what it means to face an enemy that doesn't surrender. Steve's professional composure cracked visibly. His entertainer's mask gave way to something much more human as he processed the devastating honesty of Robert's response. Here was a man who had articulated something that most people could never voice. The moment when courage meets the limits of human strength. "Robert," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "Can you tell me what that feels like?" Robert's response came with the straightforward honesty of someone who had moved beyond the need for pretense. "Every day I wake up and I know my family needs me to fight." Robert explained with heartbreaking clarity. "My wife, my children, my grandchildren, they need me to be strong, to keep battling, to believe I can win again. But some mornings I'm so tired that getting dressed feels like climbing a mountain. And I don't know how to tell them that maybe this time, love isn't enough." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television production. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced everyone in the studio. "Stop everything right now." The Family Feud theme music cut out abruptly. The cameras continued recording, but every crew member understood that they were no longer producing entertainment. Steve walked away from his podium toward Robert, his movement deliberate and respectful, like someone approaching a moment of profound human truth. The studio audience watched in complete silence as Steve approached this 68-year-old man who had just shared something devastatingly honest about the intersection of love, mortality, and the limits of human strength. Steve stopped in front of Robert, And for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. One who had spent his career making people laugh, another who had spent his life building things that lasted, both confronting the reality that some battles are bigger than individual strength. "Robert," Steve said gently, "I want you to listen to me. You've been fighting cancer for 8 years. That's not giving up. That's 8 years of getting up every morning and choosing life. That's 8 years of showing your family what courage looks like," he continued, his voice carrying conviction that seemed to reach something deep inside Robert's exhaustion. "You said you don't know if you have another war in you, but Robert, you're not fighting alone. You've got Carmen here who's been beside you for 45 years. You've got your children who would carry you if they could. You've got an entire studio of people who just heard your story and are ready to stand with you." Steve reached for Robert's shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "The hardest thing about getting older isn't running out of fight. It's learning that sometimes the greatest victory is letting the people who love you carry some of the weight. You don't have to win this battle by yourself." Robert's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since his third diagnosis, his carefully maintained composure began to crack. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I'm scared that if I stop fighting, I'll disappoint them, that I'll leave them too soon." "You could never disappoint us, Dad," Miguel called out from the family podium, his own voice thick with emotion. "We're proud of you every single day. Fighting or resting, Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, had made millions of people laugh, had built a career on bringing joy to others through entertainment. But standing with Robert Martinez, he found himself confronting the reality that some moments transcend entertainment, that some truths are bigger than any game. "Robert," Steve said, beginning to remove his suit jacket, "I want you to have something. This jacket has been with me through every Family Feud I've ever hosted. It's seen victories and defeats, laughter and tears. But today it's going home with the strongest man I've ever met." As Steve wrapped the expensive garment around Robert's thin shoulders, the symbolism was clear to everyone present. This wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was a recognition that some battles are won not through individual strength, but through the courage to accept love and support when fighting alone is no longer possible. "This jacket belongs to someone who understands that strength isn't about never falling down," Steve said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "Strength is about getting back up, again and again, until the people who love you can help you stand." Robert pulled the jacket around himself, and for the first time in months, his rigid posture relaxed slightly. The weight of the fabric seemed to provide more than warmth. It offered tangible proof that his battle was witnessed, his courage was recognized, and his struggle was shared. "Robert," Steve continued, "I want you to understand something. You're not giving up if you let your family help carry this load. You're not failing if you rest. You're not disappointing anyone. If you admit that 8 years of fighting has earned you the right to choose how you want to spend whatever time you have." Steve turned to address the entire studio audience, his voice carrying conviction that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something important. "This man taught us something today," Steve announced. "He taught us that courage isn't about never being afraid. Courage is about facing your deepest fears in front of 300 strangers, because you want to give your family a moment of joy. Courage is about admitting when you're tired. Courage is about loving people enough to let them love you back." The applause that followed was unlike any sound the Family Feud studio had ever heard. It wasn't typical game show celebration, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the profound bravery it had taken for Robert to share his truth and the grace with which he was learning to navigate an impossible situation. As the celebration continued around him, Robert stood in the center of it all, wearing Steve's jacket like a medal of honor, his family nearby with tears of pride and love. For the first time since his third diagnosis, Robert wasn't thinking about battles he might not win. He was simply present in a moment of love and support and recognition that his journey, whatever its ultimate destination, was worthy of respect. 4 months later, Robert Martinez called Steve Harvey. It was a call Steve had been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect. "Steve," Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been in the studio, "I wanted you to know the new treatment is working. The tumor is shrinking. The doctors are using the word remission again. How are you feeling about that, my friend?" Steve asked, settling in for a conversation he'd treasure. Grateful, Robert replied with surprising lightness. And different. I'm fighting again, but not the same way. This time, I'm letting my family fight with me. Carmen comes to every appointment. Miguel researches every option. Sophia makes me laugh when I'm scared. I'm not carrying it alone anymore. Steve smiled, remembering the exhausted man who had taught an entire television studio about the difference between giving up and sharing the load. The jacket that Steve had given Robert became a symbol in the Martinez family, passed between family members during difficult times as a reminder that some burdens are meant to be shared. When Robert's grandson was diagnosed with anxiety, he wore the jacket to his first therapy appointment. When Carmen's sister faced her own cancer battle, the jacket traveled with her to chemotherapy sessions. But the most important gift Robert received that day wasn't the jacket. It was the permission to redefine strength, to understand that letting people love you isn't weakness, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that you can't fight alone. Because sometimes a 68-year-old can teach an entire television studio that the greatest victories aren't won through individual heroism, but through the courage to accept the help that love offers. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten, because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in isolation, but in the arms of the people who refuse to let us face our darkest moments alone.